I have spent the better part of my life watching people exhaust themselves trying to be good, and I mean truly exhaust themselves. They wake each morning with a kind of desperate determination, checking off their moral inventory like shopkeepers counting coins. Did I help enough people today? Was I kind enough? Patient enough? Did I say the right things? Think the right thoughts? Feel the right feelings? And what strikes me most profoundly is how miserable this makes them. How utterly, completely miserable. I have sat across from countless individuals in my consulting room, and I have seen this pattern repeat itself with such regularity that I began to wonder if we have fundamentally misunderstood something essential about human nature. These people come to me depleted, confused, carrying a burden they cannot name. They have followed every rule, met every expectation, sacrificed themselves on the altar of goodness, and yet something feels terribly wrong. They describe a peculiar kind of emptiness, a hollowness that grows larger the more they try to fill it with virtuous acts. They speak of feeling like actors playing a role they never auditioned for, wearing a mask that has somehow fused to their face. And then they ask me the question that breaks my heart every time. They lean forward with desperate eyes and whisper, "What is wrong with me? Why am I not happy? Why do I feel so lost when I am doing everything right?" What is wrong with them? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. What is wrong is the entire premise they have built their lives upon. You see, there is something we have forgotten about the human soul, something our ancestors knew instinctively, but we have buried beneath layers of social conditioning and moral posturing. We have forgotten that the psyche is not a simple thing. It is not a clean, well-lit room where only acceptable thoughts are allowed to enter. The psyche is more like a vast house with many rooms, some bright and welcoming, others dark and mysterious. And we, in our desperate attempt to be good, have decided to live in only one or two of these rooms, pretending the others do not exist, boarding them up, refusing to acknowledge what lives there in the shadows. But here is what I have learned through decades of exploring the human mind, including my own. What we refuse to acknowledge does not disappear. It goes underground. It moves into the basement of our consciousness and begins to run our lives from there, pulling strings we cannot see, influencing our choices in ways we do not understand. I remember a woman who came to see me years ago. She was, by all external measures, a saint. She volunteered at charities, never spoke an unkind word, always put others before herself. Her friends called her an angel. Her family relied on her endless generosity, and she was slowly dying inside. She told me about dreams where she burned down churches. She confessed to fantasies of screaming at everyone who praised her goodness. She described a rage so intense it frightened her, a darkness so complete she was sure it made her evil. But she was not evil, she was simply human. And being human means containing within yourself the capacity for both creation and destruction, love and hatred, generosity and selfishness. The problem was not that she had these dark impulses. The problem was that she had spent her entire life trying to murder them. And what happens when you try to murder a part of yourself? It does not die quietly. It fights back. It begins to sabotage your efforts. It creates symptoms, compulsions, sudden outbursts of behavior that seem to come from nowhere. It makes you do the very things you are trying so hard not to do. This is what I came to understand about the shadow. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is simply everything you have decided you are not allowed to be. And the more energy you spend pushing it away, the more powerful it becomes. But what if I told you there is another way? What if I told you that the moment you stop trying to be a good person, something extraordinary happens? Not because you become bad, but because you finally become whole. When I say stop trying to be a good person, I do not mean abandon all ethics and run wild in the streets. I mean something far more radical and far more difficult. I mean stop performing goodness and start discovering what authentic goodness actually looks like. You see, there is a difference between genuine virtue and performed virtue, and most of us have never learned to tell them apart. Performed virtue is what we do to maintain our self-image, to win approval, to avoid guilt or shame. It is goodness as a strategy, kindness as a manipulation, love as a transaction. Genuine virtue arises from a different place entirely. It comes from integration, from wholeness, from having faced the full spectrum of what you are capable of and choosing consciously how to act. It comes from strength, not weakness, from abundance, not scarcity, from self-knowledge, not self-deception. I have watched what happens when someone finally stops trying to be good and starts trying to be real. At first, it is terrifying. They begin to notice thoughts they have never allowed themselves to think. They feel emotions they have spent years suppressing. They recognize desires they have been ashamed to acknowledge. But something remarkable occurs in this process. As they stop fighting these aspects of themselves, as they stop trying to eliminate their shadow, the shadow begins to lose its compulsive power over them. The very things they feared would destroy them, if acknowledged, become, when brought into consciousness, sources of tremendous energy and creativity. That woman I told you about, the one who dreamed of burning churches, when she finally allowed herself to feel her anger, to understand where it came from, to stop judging herself for having it, something shifted. The anger did not make her cruel. Instead, it gave her the strength to set boundaries she had never been able to set before. It helped her recognize when she was being taken advantage of. It became, paradoxically, a force for genuine compassion rather than the false kindness she had been performing for years. This is the great paradox I have discovered. The more you try to be only light, the more shadow you create. But when you acknowledge your darkness, when you integrate it consciously, it transforms. It becomes not something that controls you, but something you can choose to use wisely. Most people are afraid that if they stop trying to be good, they will become monsters. But I have found the opposite to be true. People who are trying desperately to be good often act in ways that are unconsciously cruel, manipulative, or destructive. They hurt others while telling themselves they are helping. They enable weakness while calling it compassion. They avoid difficult truths while claiming to be kind. But people who have faced their own capacity for darkness, who have acknowledged their selfishness, their anger, their petty jealousies and cruel impulses, these people often become genuinely kind. Not because they are performing kindness, but because they have chosen it consciously, with full knowledge of the alternatives. There is a strength in this kind of goodness that performed goodness never possesses. It comes from choice rather than compulsion, from wisdom rather than fear. It is goodness that can say no when necessary, that can be firm when firmness serves love, that can acknowledge difficulty rather than pretending everything is fine. But to reach this place, you must be willing to disappoint people. You must be willing to let go of the image of yourself as the good person, the helpful person, the one who never causes problems. You must be willing to be seen as flawed, human, sometimes selfish or difficult. This is perhaps the most challenging part of the journey. We have been so conditioned to believe that our worth depends on others' approval, that being seen as anything less than perfectly good feels like a kind of death. And in a way, it is. It is the death of the false self, the performed self, the self that exists only to please others. But what is born from this death is something far more valuable. What emerges is your authentic self, complete with shadows and light, capable of genuine love, because it no longer needs to perform love, capable of real strength because it is no longer weakened by internal warfare. I have seen this transformation many times, and it never ceases to amaze me. When someone stops trying to be good and starts trying to be whole, their relationships change. The people who were attracted to their performed goodness may fall away, but deeper, more authentic connections begin to form. Their work changes, becoming an expression of who they really are rather than who they think they should be. Their entire life begins to flow from a different source. And perhaps most remarkably, they begin to do genuine good in the world, not the compulsive helping that comes from guilt or the need for approval, but conscious acts of love that arise from their authentic nature. They stop enabling others' weakness and start supporting their strength. They stop avoiding difficult conversations and start speaking truth with compassion. This is what happens when you stop trying to be a good person. You do not become bad, you become real. And from that reality, genuine goodness can finally emerge. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before we can understand how to integrate our shadow, how to stop performing goodness and start living it, we must first understand what we are really dealing with. We must look more closely at this thing we call the shadow, at how it forms, how it operates, and why trying to eliminate it always fails. We must understand why the very attempt to be perfectly good creates its own form of evil, and how the path to authentic virtue requires us to walk through the valley of our own darkness with eyes wide open. The shadow, you see, begins forming the moment we draw our first breath in this world. It is not something we create deliberately. It is something that happens to us, as natural and inevitable as the growth of our bones or the beating of our hearts. Picture a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. Watch how they move through the world. They feel anger and express it immediately, without apology or shame. They feel joy and laugh with their entire being. They are selfish when they need to be, generous when it flows naturally from them. They are, in the truest sense, whole. But then something begins to happen. The adults around them start to shape them, to mold them into what they believe a good person should be. Don't be angry, they say. Nice children don't feel that way. Don't be selfish. Always share. Be kind, be quiet, be good. And so the child learns certain parts of themselves are acceptable and others are not. They learn that love and approval come with. They discover that two conditions: belong, to be safe, to be wanted. They must hide certain aspects of their nature and emphasize others. This is not malicious. The parents, the teachers, the society that does this believes it is helping the child become a better person. But what actually happens is that the child begins to split themselves in two. The acceptable parts become the persona, the mask they show the world. The unacceptable parts get pushed down into the unconscious, where they become the shadow. I remember my own childhood, how I learned that my intensity was too much for others, that my curiosity about dark subjects made people uncomfortable, that my anger was unwelcome. And so I learned to present a more acceptable version of myself to the world, while the rejected parts of me went underground. But here is what no one told me then, what no one tells any child. Those rejected parts do not simply disappear. They continue to exist, continue to grow, continue to demand expression. And because they are denied conscious expression, they begin to express themselves in unconscious ways. This is why you see the most rigidly moral people often caught in scandals that seem to come from nowhere. The preacher who rails against sexual immorality while secretly engaging in it. The politician who champions family values while destroying his own family. The parent who demands perfection from their children while living a life of quiet desperation. These are not simply hypocrites, though they may appear to be. These are people whose shadows have become so powerful, so denied, that they eventually burst forth in destructive ways. The very energy they have spent trying to suppress their darkness has given that darkness tremendous power over them. I have seen this pattern countless times in my work. A man comes to me, proud of his patience, his ability to never lose his temper, but his wife complains that he is passive-aggressive, that he punishes her with silence, that his suppressed anger poisons their entire relationship. He cannot see this because he has convinced himself that he is not an angry person, but his anger is there nonetheless, expressing itself in ways that are far more damaging than honest anger would ever be. A woman prides herself on her selflessness, her constant giving to others, but she is secretly resentful, bitter, exhausted. She gives not from love, but from a compulsive need to be seen as good. And her giving becomes a form of control, a way to make others dependent on her, to ensure they cannot leave her. Her selflessness has become a sophisticated form of selfishness, but she cannot see it because she has banished selfishness from her conscious is the cruel mind. This irony of trying to be good by rejecting parts of ourselves, we end up expressing those very qualities in distorted, unconscious ways that are far more destructive than if we had simply acknowledged them in the first place. But why does this happen? Why does the psyche work this way? I believe it is because wholeness is the fundamental drive of the human soul. The psyche will not allow itself to be permanently divided. It will always seek to integrate what has been split off, to bring into consciousness what has been repressed. And if we will not do this work consciously, it will happen unconsciously, often in ways that surprise and disturb us. I learned this lesson most powerfully during what I came to call my confrontation with the unconscious. There was a period in my life when everything I thought I knew about myself was challenged. I began to experience things I could not explain, to feel emotions I had long suppressed, to encounter aspects of my personality I had never acknowledged. It was terrifying. I feared I was going mad, but it was also liberating, because I was finally meeting myself fully, not just the carefully curated version I had presented to the world for so many years. In those dark months, I came face to face with my own capacity for cruelty, my own selfishness, my own petty jealousies and resentments. I saw how much of my apparent goodness had been performance, how much of my wisdom had been intellectual posturing, how much of my compassion had been a defense against feeling my own pain. But in seeing these things, in accepting them as part of me, rather than fighting them or denying them, something extraordinary happened. They began to lose their compulsive power. The anger I had suppressed became a source of strength and clarity. The selfishness I had denied became healthy self-care. The cruelty I had hidden became the ability to see truth clearly, even when that truth was uncomfortable. This is what I mean when I say that stopping the attempt to be good changes everything. It is honest about become bad. It is that you become not that you what you actually are, and in that honesty you discover what genuine goodness might look like. Most of us have never experienced genuine goodness because we have been too busy performing it. We have been so concerned with appearing virtuous that we have never taken the time to develop actual virtue. We have been so focused on avoiding sin that we have never learned how to choose love consciously. Real goodness, I have come to understand, is not the absence of darkness. It is the conscious integration of darkness. It is not innocence, but experience transformed into wisdom. It is not the purity of someone who has never been tempted, but the strength of someone who has faced temptation and chosen differently. When you stop trying to be good and start trying to be whole, you begin to develop what I call conscious morality rather than unconscious morality. Unconscious morality is following rules because you are supposed to, being kind because it is expected, helping others because it makes you feel good about yourself. Conscious morality is different entirely. It comes from having seen your own capacity for harm and choosing not to exercise it. It comes from having felt your own selfishness and still choosing to give. It comes from having experienced your own darkness and still choosing to bring light. There is a strength in this kind of morality that rule following can never provide. It is morality that can adapt to circumstances, that can make difficult decisions, that can sometimes appear unmoral to those who do not understand its deeper foundation. I think of a friend who stopped trying to be the perfect mother and instead became a real one. She had spent years exhausting herself trying to meet every need, solve every problem, shield her children from all difficulty. She thought this was love. But when she finally acknowledged her own resentment, her own need for space and autonomy, her own imperfection as a parent, everything changed. She began setting boundaries. She began saying no. She began allowing her children to experience the consequences of their choices rather than rescuing them constantly. To some, she appeared to have become less caring, but her children began to thrive in ways they never had before. They developed resilience, independence, genuine confidence. Her love, no longer compulsive and controlling, became spacious and empowering. This is what happens when you stop performing love and start living it. The love becomes real in a way it never was before. But I must tell you, this journey is not easy. When you begin to acknowledge your shadow, when you stop trying to be perfectly good, you will face resistance. Not just from others, but from within yourself. Part of you will be terrified of what you might find in those dark rooms of your psyche. Part of you will insist that you are different, that you do not have these ugly capacities, that your goodness is pure and untainted. And society will not support you in this work. Society needs people to stay split, to keep performing goodness while acting out their shadows unconsciously. It creates a kind of stable dysfunction that allows the collective to avoid its own shadow work. When you begin to integrate, when you become whole, you upset this balance. You become unpredictable. You can no longer be manipulated by guilt or shame. You can no longer be controlled by the promise of approval or the threat of rejection. This makes people uncomfortable. They will try to pull you back into the old patterns, back into the performance of virtue, back into the splitting that keeps everyone safe from the truth of what we actually are. But if you can resist this pressure, if you can stay committed to wholeness rather than performed goodness, you will discover something remarkable. You will find that you have more energy than you have ever had before. All the energy that was going into maintaining the split, into keeping the shadow suppressed, into performing virtue, suddenly becomes available for actual living. You will find that your relationships become deeper and more authentic. People may not always like what you say or do, but they will trust you in a way they never did before. They will sense that you are real, that what they see is what they get, that you are not hiding behind a mask, and you will find that you can do genuine good in the world. Not the compulsive helping that comes from guilt or the need to maintain a self-image, but conscious action that arises from your authentic nature. You will begin to act from a center you did not know existed. Your choices will flow from depths rather than surfaces, from wisdom rather than habit, from love rather than fear. This is what I discovered in my own life when I finally stopped trying to be the person I thought I should be and started becoming the person I actually was. The relief was extraordinary. It was like putting down a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. But let me be very clear about something. This is not a path for the faint of heart. When you begin this work of integration, when you start to acknowledge the fullness of what you are, you will encounter resistance that goes deeper than you can imagine. I remember the first time I allowed myself to feel the full force of my own ambition, my own hunger for recognition. I had spent years presenting myself as someone above such petty concerns, someone motivated purely by the desire to help others understand themselves. But when I finally admitted to myself that I wanted to be seen, to be known, to leave a mark on the world, I felt ashamed. Who was I to want such things? Wasn't this vanity? Wasn't this exactly the kind of ego-driven desire that I should have transcended by now? But as I sat with this feeling, as I stopped fighting it and started examining it, I began to understand something profound. My ambition was not separate from my desire to help others. It was intertwined with it. The same drive that wanted recognition was the drive that pushed me to develop ideas that could genuinely serve humanity. The same ego that wanted to be remembered was the ego that refused to accept superficial answers to deep questions. When I stopped trying to eliminate this aspect of myself and instead learned to work with it consciously, my work became more powerful, not less. I could acknowledge honestly what drove me, and in that honesty, I could channel that drive toward genuinely useful ends. This is what happens when you stop trying to murder parts of yourself. They stop controlling you from the shadows and start serving you in the light. But I must warn you about something else you will encounter on this path. There will be people in your life who have a vested interest in keeping you split, in keeping you performing the role of the good person rather than becoming a whole person. These are often the people closest to you. They have built their relationships with you around your performed goodness, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for their comfort, your inability to say no to their demands. When you begin to change, when you start setting boundaries and speaking truth and acting from your authentic nature rather than their expectations, they will not celebrate this growth. They will tell you that you have changed and not for the better. They will say you have become selfish, difficult, less caring than you used to be. They will try to guilt you back into the old patterns, back into the performance that served their needs even as it drained your life force. I have seen people abandon this path of integration because they could not bear to disappoint those who preferred their false self to. But I have also seen what their real self happens to those who stay committed to wholeness despite the pressure to return to performance. They become free in a way that most people never experience. Free from the exhausting work of maintaining a false image. Free from the constant anxiety of being discovered as less than perfect. Free from the resentment that builds when you give beyond your authentic capacity. Free from the emptiness that comes from living a borrowed life. And in that freedom, they discover what genuine service actually looks like. I think of a man I knew who spent decades in what he called service to others, but which was really service to his own need to be needed. He worked endless hours, solved everyone's problems, never said no to any request for help, and he was miserable. His family felt neglected, his own dreams went unfulfilled, his health suffered. But he told himself this was noble, this was what good people did. When his body finally forced him to stop, when he could no longer maintain the frantic pace of constant giving, he had to face the truth about what had been driving him. It was not love, it was fear. Fear of being rejected if he was not useful. Fear of being seen as selfish if he attended to his own needs. Fear of discovering what he actually wanted if he stopped focusing entirely on what others wanted from him. The process of facing these fears was agonizing. He had to disappoint people. He had to let others solve their own problems. He had to say no to requests that would have automatically said yes to before. He had to discover who he was when he was not busy being what others needed him to be. But what emerged from this painful process was remarkable. He began to help others in ways that were actually helpful rather than enabling. He began to give from genuine abundance rather than compulsive depletion. He began to love not because he needed to be loved in return, but because love was his authentic response to life. His service became more powerful because it was conscious rather than compulsive. His relationships deepened because they were based on truth rather than performance. His life became his own because he was finally living it from his center rather than from everyone else's expectations. This is what I mean when I say that everything changes when you stop trying to be a good person. You do not become worse, you become more yourself. And from that authentic center, genuine goodness can finally emerge. But there is another aspect of this transformation that I must address, because it is perhaps the most difficult for people to accept. When you integrate your shadow, when you acknowledge the fullness of what you are capable of, you will discover that you are capable of much more darkness than you ever imagined. They believe that if they truly terrifies people face their capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for destruction, they will become cruel, selfish, and destructive. But I have found the opposite to be true. The people who frighten me are not those who know their own darkness. The people who frighten me are those who insist they have no darkness at all. Because when you refuse to acknowledge your capacity for harm, that capacity does not disappear. It goes underground, where it begins to express itself in unconscious ways that are far more dangerous than conscious darkness could ever be. The person who insists they are never angry becomes passive-aggressive, poisoning relationships with subtle cruelty. The person who prides themselves on their humility becomes secretly arrogant, looking down on those they deem less enlightened. The person who claims to have no selfish desires becomes manipulative, getting their needs met through emotional manipulation rather than honest request. But when you face your darkness directly, when you acknowledge your capacity for all the things you have judged in others, something extraordinary happens. You develop genuine compassion, not the performative kind that looks down on those who struggle with obvious sins, but the deep understanding that comes from recognizing your shared humanity with every person who has ever fallen short of their ideals. You realize that the person who is cruel is not fundamentally different from you. They are simply acting out unconsciously what you have learned to integrate consciously. The person who is selfish is not your moral inferior. They are simply expressing openly what you have learned to channel constructively. This recognition changes everything about how you relate to others. You stop dividing the world into good people and bad people because you understand that we all contain the same fundamental capacities. The only difference is how conscious we are about them and how skillfully we work with them. I remember the first time I truly understood this. I was dealing with someone who had hurt me deeply, someone whose behavior seemed inexcusably cruel. And as I felt my anger rising, as I prepared to judge them as fundamentally different from myself, something shifted. I saw clearly that I contained within myself the exact same capacity that had driven their behavior. Under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, with the right unconscious patterns activated, I could have done exactly what they had done. This realization did not excuse their behavior. It did not mean I had to tolerate ongoing harm, but it dissolved my sense of moral superiority, my comfortable position of being the wronged party, dealing with a fundamentally flawed person. Instead, I found myself responding from a place of genuine understanding. I could set boundaries without hatred. I could protect myself without demonizing them. I could acknowledge the harm without pretending I was incapable of causing similar harm under different circumstances. This is what integration does. It makes you more human, not less. It makes you more compassionate, not more callous. It makes you more capable of genuine goodness, because that goodness flows from understanding rather than ignorance, from choice rather than compulsion. But perhaps most importantly, it makes you trustworthy in a way that performed goodness never can. When someone has faced their own darkness and learned to work with it consciously, they become safe to be around, not because they are perfect, but because they are aware. They know their own triggers, their own blind spots, their own capacity for harm, and because they know these things, they can manage them. The person who insists they have no darkness is dangerous because they cannot see it coming when that darkness begins to express itself. They cannot take responsibility for it because they have convinced themselves it does not exist. They cannot make amends for it because they cannot acknowledge it. But the person who has integrated their shadow can see the early warning signs when their darkness is being activated. They can take responsibility for their impact on others. They can make conscious choices about how to respond to difficult situations rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. This is what authentic maturity looks like. Not the absence of difficult emotions and impulses, but the conscious relationship with them. Not the elimination of selfishness, but the ability to choose when to be selfish and when to be generous. Not the suppression of anger, but the wisdom to know when anger serves love and when it serves ego. When you reach this place, when you have done the work of integration, your entire relationship with morality changes. You stop following rules because you are supposed to and start making conscious choices based on deep understanding. You stop trying to be good and start being real. And from that reality, genuine virtue naturally emerges. This is the great secret that our culture has forgotten. We have become so focused on avoiding sin that we have forgotten how to choose love. We have become so concerned with appearing virtuous that we have never learned what virtue-like from actually feels the inside. But when you stop trying to be good and start trying to be whole, you discover something remarkable. Goodness is not something you do. It is something you are when you are fully yourself. Love is not a feeling you manufacture. It is what flows naturally from an integrated psyche. Compassion is not a practice you perform. It is the inevitable result of recognizing your fundamental unity with all life. This is why I say that everything changes when you stop trying to be a good person. Not because you abandon goodness, but because you discover what goodness actually is when it is not being performed for an audience, when it is not being used to maintain an image, when it is not being deployed as a strategy for getting your needs met. You discover that real goodness is wild, unpredictable, sometimes uncomfortable. It tells the truth even when the truth is difficult. It sets boundaries even when boundary setting appears unkind. It allows others to face the consequences of their choices even when intervention would seem more caring. Real goodness serves life rather than ego. It serves growth rather than comfort. It serves truth rather than the maintenance of pleasant illusions. And most paradoxically, real goodness sometimes looks like what conventional morality would call badness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's weakness. Sometimes the most compassionate response is to allow someone to fail. Sometimes the most generous act is to say no to a request that would harm both you and the person making it. This is why integration is so essential. Without it, you cannot distinguish between genuine goodness and performed goodness. Without it, you cannot tell the difference between love and enablement, between compassion and codependence, between service and self-sacrifice. But with integration, with a conscious relationship to your own darkness, these distinctions become clear. You can feel the difference in your body between actions that serve life and actions that serve ego. You can sense when your giving comes from abundance and when it comes from depletion. You can recognize when your kindness empowers others and when it diminishes them. This is the gift that comes from no longer trying to be good. You become genuinely good in ways you never could when goodness was a performance you had to maintain. But I want to return to something I mentioned earlier, because it is crucial for understanding why this path is so difficult and why so few people choose it. When you begin to integrate your shadow, when you stop performing goodness and start living authentically, you will lose some relationships. This is inevitable. Some people in your life are not in relationship with you. They are in relationship with the role you play for them, the function you serve in their psychological economy. When you stop playing that role, when you stop serving that function, they will experience this as betrayal, even though you are simply becoming real. I have seen people return to patterns of self-betrayal, return to the exhausting work of performing goodness, because they could not bear to lose these relationships. But what they do not understand is that relationships based on performance are not real relationships at all. They are transactions disguised as connections. Real relationship can only exist between real people. And you cannot be real while you are busy performing a role, maintaining an image, hiding aspects of yourself that you fear might be unacceptable. When you become authentic, when you integrate your shadow and start living from your whole self, you may lose the people who preferred your performance, but you will gain something far more valuable. You will gain the possibility of genuine connection with others who are also willing to be real. These relationships will be different from anything you have experienced before. They will be based on truth rather than mutual deception, on acceptance rather than judgment, on growth rather than the maintenance of comfortable patterns. And perhaps most importantly, you will finally have a real relationship with yourself. I have spent many years watching people exhaust themselves in what they call self-improvement, and I have begun to see a pattern that disturbs me greatly. They read endless books about becoming better versions of themselves. They attend workshops on manifesting their dreams. They practice gratitude and meditation and positive thinking with the same desperate intensity that others might use to dig themselves out of a grave. And yet, something essential remains unchanged. They are still running from the same demons, still carrying the same wounds, still repeating the same patterns that brought them to seek improvement. Is this? Why does in the first place? Why all this effort to become better so rarely result in genuine transformation? I believe it is because we have fundamentally misunderstood what it means to change. We approach transformation the same way we approach everything else in our achievement-oriented culture. We set goals. We measure progress. We try to force ourselves to become something we are not yet ready to be. But the psyche does not work this way. The psyche is not a machine that can be reprogrammed through willpower and technique. It is a living system with its own intelligence, its own timing, its own way of healing and growing. And most importantly, the psyche will not allow you to skip steps. It will not let you transcend what you have never integrated. It will not permit you to become someone new while you are still running from who you actually are. I learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. There was a period in my life when I thought I had transcended my own darkness, when I believed I had evolved beyond the petty concerns and destructive impulses that seemed to plague ordinary people. I had developed theories about the human mind. I had helped countless patients understand their own psychological patterns. I had written books about the process of individuation, about becoming whole, and I began to believe that I had achieved what I wrote about. But life has a way of humbling us when we become too comfortable with our own supposed evolution. And my humbling came in the form of a complete psychological breakdown that forced me to confront everything I thought I had moved beyond. For months, I was visited by visions and voices that I could not explain or control. I experienced emotions so intense they threatened to tear me apart. I encountered aspects of my personality that I had convinced myself no longer existed. At first, I fought these experiences. I tried to analyze them, to understand them intellectually, to regain the sense of mastery I had cultivated over my inner life. But the more I fought, the more powerful they became. It was only when I stopped fighting, when I stopped trying to improve or transcend or fix what was happening to me, that something shifted. I began to listen to these voices instead of silencing them. I began to dialogue with these aspects of myself instead of banishing them. I began to accept what was happening instead of trying to make it stop. And in that acceptance, in that surrender to what was actually occurring rather than what I thought should be occurring, genuine transformation began. I realized that all my previous efforts at self-improvement had been subtle forms of self-rejection. I had been trying to become a better version of myself because I could not accept the version that already existed. I had been seeking transformation because I was at war with my current reality. But transformation does not come from rejecting what is. It comes from fully accepting what is and allowing it to change naturally in its own time according to its own intelligence. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for modern people to accept. We have been trained to believe that if we are not actively working to improve ourselves, we are stagnating. We fear that acceptance means resignation, that surrendering to what is means giving up on what could be. But I have discovered something remarkable in my years of working with the human psyche. The moment you truly accept yourself as you are, without trying to change or fix or improve anything, you create the conditions in which genuine change becomes possible. This is not the change that comes from force or willpower or technique. This is organic change, natural change, change that arises from the depths of your being rather than from the demands of your ego or the expectations of others. I remember a patient who came to me consumed with anxiety about his lack of success in life. He was in his 40s, had never achieved the career advancement he desired, had never found the romantic relationship he longed for, had never developed the confidence and charisma he believed he needed to be happy. He had spent years trying to improve himself. He had read every self-help book, attended every seminar, practiced every technique, and yet nothing had changed. If anything, his anxiety had increased because now he was failing not only at life but also at self-improvement. We spent months together, and gradually I began to help him see that his very effort to improve was part of what was keeping him stuck. His constant focus on becoming someone different was preventing him from fully inhabiting who he actually was. I encouraged him to stop trying to change anything about himself for a period of time. Instead, I suggested he simply observe himself with curiosity rather than judgment. Notice his anxiety without trying to eliminate it. Feel his sadness without rushing to fix it. Experience his longing without immediately trying to fulfill it. At first, this felt impossible to him. His entire identity was built around the project of self-improvement. Without that project, who would he be? What would be the point of his existence if he was not constantly working to become better? But slowly, gradually, he began to discover something he had never experienced before. peace. Not the peace that comes from achieving your goals or solving your problems, but the peace that comes from no longer being at war with yourself. And from that peace, natural changes began to emerge. His relationships improved because he was no longer desperately trying to become someone worthy of love. His work became more fulfilling because he was no longer frantically chasing external validation. His anxiety decreased because he was no longer adding the additional layer of anxiety about being anxious. He did not become a different person. He became more fully himself, and in becoming more fully himself, he naturally began to live in ways that were more aligned with his authentic nature. This is what I have come to understand about genuine transformation. It is not about becoming someone new. It is about removing the obstacles that prevent you from being who you already are at the deepest level. Most of us spend our entire lives trying to become someone we think we should be while running from someone we think we should not be. We exhaust ourselves in this endless project of self-creation, never realizing that what we are seeking already exists within us, buried beneath layers of conditioning and expectation and fear. The work is not to create a new self. The work is to excavate the authentic self that has been there all along. But this excavation requires something that our culture actively discourages. It requires stillness. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to eliminate it. We live in a world that promises instant transformation. Change your thoughts and change your life. Follow these 7 steps to success. Manifest your dreams in 30 days. But the psyche operates on a different timeline entirely. Real change happens slowly, quietly, often invisibly. It happens in the spaces between thoughts, in the moments when you are not trying to become anything at all. It happens when you finally stop running long enough to discover what you have been running from. I think of the process like tending a garden. You can plant seeds, you can water them, you can provide good soil and adequate sunlight, but you cannot force them to grow faster than they are naturally inclined to grow. You cannot pull on the shoots to make them taller. You cannot open the buds to make the flowers bloom before their time. All you can do is create the conditions in which growth can occur naturally, and then trust the intelligence of life to do what it knows how to do. The same is true with psychological transformation. You can create conditions that support growth. You can remove obstacles. You can provide nourishment in the form of honest self-reflection and genuine self-acceptance. But you cannot force the process to happen according to your timeline or your agenda. This requires a fundamental shift in how we approach change. Instead of asking, how can I become different? We must learn to ask, how can I become more fully myself? Instead of focusing on what is wrong with us, that needs to be fixed, we must learn to focus on what is right with us, that needs to be expressed. This is not about settling for mediocrity or abandoning all desire for growth. It is about understanding that genuine growth happens from the inside out, not from the outside in. It happens when we align with our authentic nature rather than when we try to force ourselves into a mold that was never designed for us. I have watched people transform in the most remarkable ways when they finally stop trying to transform and start accepting what is actually true for them in each moment. Their relationships become more authentic because they are no longer performing a role. Their work becomes more meaningful because it flows from their genuine interests rather than their perceived obligations. Their entire life begins to reorganize itself around their true center rather than around external expectations. But this kind of transformation requires courage. It requires the courage to disappoint people who prefer your false self to your real self. It requires the courage to live according to your own inner authority rather than the approval of others. It requires the courage to trust your own process even when it does not look like progress to the outside world. Most people are not willing to pay this price. They would rather stay trapped in familiar patterns of struggle than risk the unknown territory of authentic being. They would rather exhaust themselves trying to become someone else than discover who they actually are beneath all the trying. But for those who are willing, for those who can surrender the project of self-improvement and embrace the process of self-discovery, something extraordinary awaits. They find that they do not need to become someone different to be happy. They discover that happiness was never about becoming anything at all. They realize that what they have been seeking through all their efforts at transformation was always available to them, hidden not in some future version of themselves, but in the depths of who they have always been. This is the great irony of human existence. We spend our lives trying to become worthy of love, not realizing that we are already loved. We exhaust ourselves trying to become acceptable, not seeing that we are already acceptable. We struggle to become enough, never noticing that we have always been enough. The moment we stop trying to be good enough, smart enough, successful enough, attractive enough, we discover that we already are enough. Not because we have achieved something or improved something or fixed something, but simply because we exist. This recognition changes everything. When you know that you are already whole, you stop trying to complete yourself through external achievements or relationships or experiences. When you know that you are already worthy, you stop trying to earn your worth through performance or productivity or perfection. And from this place of inherent wholeness and worth, you begin to live differently. You make choices based on what genuinely serves your authentic nature rather than what you think will make you more acceptable to others. You give from abundance rather than depletion. You love from fullness rather than emptiness. This is what happens when you stop trying to be a good person and start being a real person. This is what happens when you stop trying to improve yourself and start accepting yourself. This is what happens when you finally come home to who you have always been, beneath all the trying and striving and performing. Everything changes because you realize that nothing needed to change. You were always already what you were seeking to become. You just forgot how to see it. And so we arrive at perhaps the most difficult recognition of all. When you finally stop trying to be good, when you cease this exhausting performance of virtue, you must face something that terrifies most people more than their own darkness. You must face your own light. Yes, you heard me correctly. It is not our darkness that frightens us most deeply. It is our light, our capacity for genuine love, for real wisdom, for authentic power. We are more afraid of our magnificence than we are of our mediocrity. I have sat with countless souls who could catalogue their flaws with surgical precision, who could recite their failures like a litany of sins, who knew every shadow corner of their psyche with intimate detail. But ask them to name their gifts, to acknowledge their beauty, to own their strength, and they become speechless, uncomfortable, almost physically ill. Why is this? Why do we find it easier to embrace our limitations than our possibilities? Because to acknowledge our light means to acknowledge our responsibility. If I am capable of great love, then I must ask myself why I withhold it. If I possess genuine wisdom, then I must examine why I live so foolishly. If I have authentic power, then I must face why I give it away so freely to others. Our darkness feels safe because it excuses us. I am flawed, we say. Therefore, I cannot be expected to live fully. But our light offers no such refuge. Our light demands that we step into the fullness of what we are capable of becoming. I remember the moment I first glimpsed my own capacity for genuine understanding. Not the intellectual understanding I had cultivated through years of study, but the direct, intuitive knowing that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. It was terrifying, because with that recognition came the awareness that I could no longer pretend to be confused about things I actually understood quite clearly. I could no longer claim ignorance as an excuse for inaction. I could no longer hide behind uncertainty when clarity was available to me. I had to take responsibility for what I knew, even when that knowledge demanded difficult choices. This is what happens when you stop trying to be good and start being real. You discover that you are far more capable than you have allowed yourself to believe. You realize that much of what you have called inability was actually unwillingness. You see that many of the problems you have spent years trying to solve are problems you have been unconsciously perpetuating. The recognition is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because you finally understand that you have more power than you thought. Terrifying because with that power comes the responsibility to use it. I think of a woman who came to see me convinced she was weak, helpless, dependent on others for her survival. She had built her entire identity around her vulnerability, her need for protection, her inability to function independently. And indeed, her life seemed to confirm this story. She moved from one dependent relationship to another, always finding someone to take care of her, always playing the role of the fragile one who needed saving. But as we worked together, as she began to examine the unconscious patterns that governed her life, something remarkable emerged. She was not weak at all. She was extraordinarily strong, but she had learned to use her strength in unconscious ways. Her apparent helplessness was actually a sophisticated form of control. Her vulnerability was a weapon she used to manipulate others into caring for her. Her dependence was a strategy she employed to avoid the responsibility that would come with acknowledging her own capabilities. When she finally saw this, when she recognized the power she had been wielding unconsciously, she was horrified. "I'm not the person I thought I was," she said. "I'm manipulative. I'm controlling. I'm not weak at all." But I helped her see that this recognition was not cause for self-condemnation. It was cause for celebration. She was finally meeting her authentic power, finally seeing the strength she had always possessed. The question was not whether she would continue to have this power. The question was whether she would use it consciously or unconsciously, constructively or destructively. This is what integration truly means. Not the elimination of difficult traits, but the conscious relationship with all of who you are. Not the transcendence of your human nature, but the full embodiment of it. When you stop trying to be good and start being whole, you discover that you contain within yourself capacities for both creation and destruction, love and hatred, generosity and selfishness, wisdom and foolishness. The goal is not to eliminate half of these capacities. The goal is to develop the consciousness to choose which ones to express in each moment. But consciousness is not a comfortable state. It requires constant vigilance, constant choice, constant responsibility. It is much easier to live unconsciously, to be driven by patterns you do not understand, to react from conditioning you have never examined. This is why most people prefer the familiar prison of trying to be good to the frightening freedom of being real. The prison has rules, boundaries, clear expectations. You know what you are supposed to do, even if doing it exhausts you. But freedom requires you to choose. moment by moment, how to be. And choice is terrifying because it means you cannot blame your circumstances, your conditioning, or your limitations for the life you create. I have watched people stand at the threshold of this freedom and turn back again and again, choosing the familiar suffering of self-betrayal over the unknown territory of authentic being. They would rather stay trapped in patterns that do not serve them than risk discovering what might be possible if they lived from their true nature. But for those who cross this threshold, for those who choose consciousness over comfort, authenticity over approval, something extraordinary happens. They discover that life has been waiting for them all along. Not the life they thought they should live, not the life others expected them to live, but the life that can only be lived by them in their unique way according to their own inner authority. This life does not look like what they imagined it would look like. It is not necessarily easier or more comfortable or more socially acceptable, but it is theirs in a way that no other life could ever be. And from this authentic ground, they begin to contribute to the world in ways that no one else can. Their gifts, no longer hidden behind masks of performed goodness, begin to serve life naturally, effortlessly, powerfully. They stop trying to help people and start genuinely helping them. They stop trying to love and start loving. They stop trying to be wise and start speaking from wisdom. The difference is unmistakable. There is a quality to authentic expression that cannot be manufactured, cannot be performed, cannot be imitated. When someone speaks from their true voice, when they act from their authentic nature, when they love from their real heart, something in us recognizes it immediately. We feel seen, understood, touched in a way that all the performed goodness in the world could never accomplish. This is the gift that you withhold from the world when you spend your energy trying to be good instead of being real. This is the contribution that remains unmade when you focus on maintaining an image instead of expressing your authentic nature. The world does not need more people trying to be good. The world needs more people who are genuinely good, and genuine goodness can only emerge from genuine being. But let me tell you something that may surprise you. When you finally stop trying to be good and start being authentic, when you integrate your shadow and embrace your light, when you take full responsibility for the magnitude of what you are, you will discover that you are not special. This may sound contradictory, but it is perhaps the most important recognition of all. In becoming fully yourself, you realize that the self you have been defending, protecting, and trying to improve does not exist in the way you thought it did. What you discover is that underneath all the performance, beyond all the masks, beneath all the trying and striving and becoming, there is something much simpler and much more profound. There is consciousness itself, aware and awake and utterly ordinary. You are not separate from life. You are life expressing itself as you. You are not an individual struggling to survive in a hostile world. You are the world looking at itself through the eyes of what you call yourself. When this recognition dawns, when you see that the boundaries between self and other, between you and the world, are much more fluid than you imagined, everything changes again. You stop trying to get something from life and start giving something to life. You stop asking what the world can do for you and start asking what you can do for the world, not from duty or obligation, but from the natural overflow of a heart that has finally come home to itself. This is the ultimate paradox of the human journey. In trying to become someone special, you remain ordinary. But in accepting your ordinariness, you discover that you are extraordinary in the most simple and profound way possible. You are consciousness itself, temporarily forgetting what you are, playing at being separate, exploring what it feels like to be human, to struggle, to suffer, to awaken, to remember. And in that remembering, you realize that you never needed to become good. You never needed to improve yourself. You never needed to be different than you are. You only needed to wake up to what has always been true. You only needed to stop running from yourself long enough to discover who you actually are. And who you are, underneath all the stories and roles and performances, is love itself. Not love as an emotion or a feeling, but love as the fundamental fabric of existence, the creative force that brings all things into being and holds them in perfect relationship. When you stop trying to be a good person, you discover that you are not a person at all. You are love pretending to be a person, consciousness playing at being separate, the infinite exploring itself through the finite. And from this recognition, everything you do becomes an expression of love, not because you are trying to be loving, but because there is nothing else you could possibly be. This is what I have learned in my long journey through the depths of the human psyche. This is what the light revealed, what the integration darkness taught me, of both shadow and brilliance made possible. We are not broken beings who need to be fixed. We are not flawed humans who need to become good. We are love itself, temporarily forgetting what we are, slowly remembering through the very process of being human. And when we remember, when we stop trying and start being, when we cease performing and begin living, everything changes. Not because we have become someone different, but because we have finally become who we have always been. The trying can stop now. The performance can end. The mask can come off. What remains is what was always there, waiting patiently for you to stop looking everywhere else and finally come home. You see, my friend, as I reach the end of these reflections, I realize that I have been speaking not just to you, but to myself, to the part of me that once believed I could perfect myself through effort, improve myself through will, become worthy through performance. I have been speaking to the exhausted soul in each of us that has spent so many years trying to be what we thought we should be instead of discovering what we actually are. The great joke, the cosmic irony that took me decades to understand, is that in all our trying to become good, we miss the extraordinary ordinariness of simply being human. We miss the profound gift of this moment, this breath, this awareness that reads these words and recognizes itself in them. When you finally stop trying to be a good person, you do not become a bad person. You do not become anything at all. You simply are. And in that simple being, without effort or performance or apology, something genuine can finally emerge. Not the love you manufacture to appear caring, but the love that you are when you stop pretending to be anything else. Not the wisdom you collect to seem enlightened, but the knowing that arises naturally when you cease being at war with yourself. This is my invitation to you, though it is really life's invitation, extended through every moment of difficulty, every shadow you encounter, every time you feel the exhaustion of trying to be someone you are not. Stop trying, start being. The world is waiting not for your performance, but for your presence. Not for your goodness, but for your truth. Not for who you think you should be, but for who you have always been beneath all the trying. Everything changes when you remember this. Everything has always been waiting for you to come home.